On December 16, 2020, in the final weeks of the Trump administration, the United States Department of the Treasury dropped an economic and diplomatic bombshell. In its semi-annual report on the foreign exchange policies of major trading partners, it officially designated two countries as currency manipulators, Switzerland and Vietnam. For Switzerland, a wealthy, stable economy, the label was perplexing. But for Vietnam, it was a profound shock. The designation placed Hanoi in the same penalty box that Beijing had occupied just a year earlier, threatening a trade war with a country the US was actively courting as a cornerstone of its Indo-Pacific strategy. The move was a startling contradiction. For years, Washington had been methodically strengthening its ties with Hanoi, viewing the rapidly growing nation as a critical partner and a vital counterweight to China's expanding influence in Southeast Asia. The two former enemies had normalized relations in 1995, signed a pivotal bilateral trade agreement in 2000, and elevated their relationship to a comprehensive partnership in 2013. By 2020, high-level diplomatic and military exchanges were routine, and US strategy documents explicitly identified Vietnam as an emerging security partner. This brings us to the central question of this story. Why would the United States risk derailing its relationship with one of its most important strategic partners in Asia over a technical currency dispute? The answer is not simple. It lies at the complex intersection of rigid American trade law, the unintended consequences of a global trade war, and the delicate diplomatic dance between a superpower and a rising middle power. This was not a premeditated attack on a partner, but rather the logical, almost automated outcome of a collision between two powerful and opposing forces. On one side was Vietnam's explosive, export-led economic growth, which had been supercharged by the very US trade war against China. On the other was a rigid, criteria-driven US trade enforcement policy that, under the America First doctrine, was designed to be blind to geopolitical nuance. The crisis was, in essence, a friendly fire incident waiting to happen, a direct and predictable consequence of one American policy creating the very conditions for another American policy to be triggered against a key ally. To understand how Vietnam ended up in Washington's crosshairs, one must first understand its remarkable economic trajectory. After the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, the country was economically devastated and internationally isolated. For over a decade, it languished under a centrally planned system that stifled growth. The turning point came in 1986 with the launch of the Choi Moi, or renovation, reforms. This was a fundamental pivot away from central planning and toward a socialist-oriented market economy. The Choi Moi reforms unleashed the Vietnamese economy. The government decentralized control, encouraged private enterprise, and critically began opening the country to the world. A key reform was the 1993 land law, which granted land use rights that could be traded and inherited, boosting agricultural productivity. But the most transformative element was the embrace of foreign trade and investment. Vietnam actively pursued an export-led growth, ELG model, a strategy that had previously fueled the rise of the East Asian miracle economies like South Korea and Taiwan. The core idea of ELG is that by producing for global markets, a country can achieve greater efficiency, absorb modern technology, and stimulate a virtuous cycle of growth. Foreign direct investment, FDI, was the engine of this model. Vietnam rolled out the welcome mat for international corporations, offering tax incentives and developing industrial zones. The results were staggering. Giants like Samsung, LG, and Intel set up massive manufacturing operations, transforming Vietnam into a global production hub for electronics, textiles, apparel, and footwear. By 2022, FDI-backed companies accounted for over 70% of Vietnam's total export revenues. This strategy made Vietnam's economy one of the most open in the world. By 2020, its trade-to-GDP ratio had surpassed an astonishing 160%. This success earned it the moniker Asia's other miracle, but its deep integration into global supply chains was both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The geopolitical landscape of the late 2010s provided a massive, unexpected accelerant to Vietnam's economic engine, the US-China trade war. Beginning in 2018, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. In response, multinational companies scrambled to move their supply chains out of China to avoid the new taxes. This phenomenon, known as trade diversion, created a geopolitical windfall for Vietnam. Due to its geographical proximity to China, competitive labor costs, and established manufacturing infrastructure, Vietnam became the primary beneficiary of this corporate exodus. Companies could jump the tariff wall by shifting final assembly of their products to Vietnam before exporting them to the United States. The data reveals a clear pattern. As US tariffs on China took effect, Chinese exports of intermediate goods and components to Vietnam surged. Simultaneously, Vietnam's exports of finished goods to the United States skyrocketed. For example, in 2019, US imports from Vietnam jumped by over 35%, while imports from China fell. This shift directly fueled the explosion in Vietnam's bilateral trade surplus with the United States, the central irritant in the currency dispute. The very success that made Vietnam a poster child for supply chain diversification also painted a target on its back. The US-China trade war created a bizarre paradox for Vietnam. It was a massive economic boon, accelerating its rise as a manufacturing powerhouse and cementing its importance as a strategic alternative to China. Yet this very success, measured in the cold, hard numbers of a bilateral trade balance, made it a prime target for the US Treasury's narrow, deficit-focused enforcement regime. The policy designed to counter China inadvertently created the statistical evidence used to punish a key partner in that same anti-China strategy. Vietnam was caught in a friendly fire incident, a casualty of its own success. The widening trade gap was impossible to ignore. A look at the bilateral goods trade balance in the years leading up to the designation shows an unmistakable trend. As the table clearly shows, the deficit ballooned by over 40% in 2019 alone, the first full year of the trade war's effects. It was this dramatic surge that set off alarm bells in Washington and put the US and Vietnam on a collision course. The Treasury Department's decision to label Vietnam a currency manipulator was not arbitrary. It was the result of a methodical, if rigid, application of US law. The designation was based on two key statutes: the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act of 1988, which gives the Treasury broad authority to analyze currency practices, and more specifically, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015. The 2015 Act was crucial because it established three specific, quantitative criteria that, if met, would automatically trigger enhanced analysis and could lead to a manipulator designation. The 2015 Act was designed to take the guesswork out of identifying unfair currency practices by creating a simple, data-driven checklist. To be flagged for potential manipulation, a country had to meet all three of the following criteria over a 12-month period: a significant bilateral trade surplus with the United States. At the time, this was defined as a goods surplus of at least $20 billion. A material global current account surplus. The threshold for this was a surplus equivalent to at least 2% of the country's gross domestic product, GDP. The current account is the broadest measure of a country's trade, including not just goods, but also services and financial transfers. Persistent, one-sided foreign exchange, FX, intervention. This meant the country's central bank was consistently buying foreign currency, usually US dollars, to keep its own currency from appreciating. The specific test was net purchases of foreign currency totaling at least 2% of GDP over at least 6 of the 12 months. This three-part test created a clear, if inflexible, tripwire. For the Trump administration, which viewed large trade deficits as a sign of cheating, it was a powerful tool to pressure trading partners. In its December 2020 report, the Treasury Department laid out its case, meticulously documenting how Vietnam, for the 4 quarters ending in June 2020, had tripped all 3 wires. First, the bilateral trade surplus. As a direct result of the trade diversion from China, Vietnam's goods trade surplus with the US reached $58 billion during the period under review. This was nearly 3 times the $20 billion threshold, making it an easy and undeniable first strike. Second, the global current account surplus. Vietnam's overall current account surplus stood at 4.6% of its GDP. This was more than double the 2% threshold, ticking the second box. While economists might debate the significance of this figure for a developing country, it unequivocally met the statutory test. Third, and most contentiously, was the foreign exchange intervention. The Treasury found that the State Bank of Vietnam, SBV, had engaged in large-scale, protracted intervention to prevent the Vietnamese dong from strengthening. Its net purchases of foreign currency amounted to an estimated 5.1% of GDP, blowing past the 2% threshold. This was the smoking gun for the Treasury, as it appeared to be direct action to hold down the currency's value. From a purely legalistic and mechanical perspective, the case was closed. Vietnam had met all 3 criteria laid out in the 2015 law. The Treasury report concluded that at least part of Vietnam's exchange rate management was for the purpose of preventing effective balance of payments adjustments and gaining unfair competitive advantage in international trade. The Treasury's designation, while damaging, was not the only threat facing Vietnam. An even more immediate danger came from a parallel investigation launched in October 2020 by the Office of the United States Trade Representative, USTR, under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Section 301 is a powerful and controversial tool that allows the U.S. President to impose unilateral tariffs or other trade restrictions on any country whose trade practices are deemed unreasonable or discriminatory and burden U.S. commerce. It was the same authority used to launch the trade war with China. The USTR investigation focused specifically on whether Vietnam's currency practices were actionable under Section 301. On January 15, 2021, just days before the end of the Trump administration, USTR released its findings. It concluded that Vietnam's currency policies were indeed unreasonable and burden or restrict U.S. commerce, providing the legal justification for imposing punitive tariffs. However, in a crucial move, USTR announced it would not take any specific action at that time, effectively handing the hot potato to the incoming Biden administration. This decision created a moment of intense uncertainty. The legal groundwork for a trade war had been laid, and the fuse was lit. Whether it would be extinguished or allowed to detonate would depend entirely on the priorities of the new team in the White House. While the technical case against Vietnam appeared straightforward, it rested on a narrow interpretation of data that ignored both the country's specific circumstances and the broader economic context. The designation immediately drew a sharp rebuttal from Hanoi and trenchant criticism from independent economists, who argued that the Treasury's verdict was a classic case of misdiagnosing the problem. The State Bank of Vietnam, SBV, moved swiftly to reject the currency manipulator label. In a series of statements, Vietnamese officials consistently denied that their policies were designed to create an unfair trade advantage. Their defense rested on 2 core arguments, which they maintained were the legitimate and primary goals of their monetary policy. First, the SBV asserted that its management of the exchange rate was aimed at achieving domestic macroeconomic stability, a core mandate for any central bank. For a rapidly growing and transforming economy like Vietnam's, preventing wild swings in the currency is crucial for controlling inflation, ensuring financial stability, and providing a predictable environment for investment. They argued that a stable dong, pegged loosely to the US dollar, was a necessary anchor for their economy, not a tool for trade predation. Second, the SBV addressed the large-scale foreign currency purchases directly. They argued that these interventions were not meant to suppress the dong's value for competitive gain, but rather to build up the country's critically low foreign exchange reserves. Compared to its regional peers and international benchmarks, such as holding enough reserves to cover at least 3 months of imports, Vietnam's reserves were dangerously thin. In the face of massive capital inflows driven by the trade war, the SBV saw an opportunity to purchase dollars and build a much-needed buffer against future economic shocks. This, they contended, was a matter of prudent national financial management, not currency warfare. The arguments from Hanoi were strongly supported by a chorus of independent economists who saw the Treasury's designation as a profound analytical failure. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, a respected Washington think tank, published a particularly sharp critique, calling the designation a substantive mistake that illustrated the broader problems with the concept of currency manipulation. The critique dismantled the Treasury's case on several grounds. First, the very idea of a currency being undervalued is notoriously difficult to measure. The PIIE pointed out the fragility of the economic models used for such calculations. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, for instance, had produced 2 separate assessments for Vietnam's currency in 2018, with wildly divergent results. One model, the External Balance Assessment, found the dong to be 8.4% undervalued. But another, the Real Effective Exchange Rate model, found it to be 15.2% overvalued. This massive discrepancy highlighted that these methodologies provide, at best, very rough and fragile answers, and are far from the kind of precise science that should trigger punitive trade actions. Second, the critics lambasted the Treasury's reliance on the bilateral trade balance. There is widespread agreement among economists that a bilateral trade figure is a poor and misleading indicator of a country's overall economic policies. A country's global current account balance is the more relevant metric, and Vietnam's, at 1.2% of GDP in 2020, was relatively small and had actually decreased from the previous year. The ballooning bilateral surplus with the US was not the result of a change in Vietnamese policy, but a direct consequence of US policy, namely, the trade war with China that shifted supply chains. Third, the designation failed to account for Vietnam's status as a developing nation. The Treasury applied the same rigid template to Vietnam that it did to Switzerland, a highly developed economy with one of the world's strongest currencies, which acts as a global safe haven. This one-size-fits-all approach ignored the fact that developing countries have legitimate reasons to manage their exchange rates and build reserves to protect themselves from volatile capital flows and external shocks. In fact, the Swiss were intervening to fight deflationary pressures caused by capital inflows seeking safety, a completely different economic problem than what Vietnam faced. The simultaneous designation of both countries exposed the absurdity of a mechanical, box-ticking exercise that was blind to context. Ultimately, the currency manipulator designation was a political act dressed up in technical language. The 2015 Act's 3-part test, while seemingly objective, became a blunt instrument used to advance the Trump administration's singular focus on bilateral trade deficits. The administration's core trade philosophy held that these deficits were inherently bad and a sign of unfair practices by trading partners. The law provided a convenient mechanism to act on this belief. When Vietnam's soaring surplus made it a target, the Treasury applied the criteria mechanically, ignoring the exculpatory context and the deep flaws in the underlying economic analysis. The process was about checking boxes to justify a predetermined conclusion, not about conducting a nuanced and fair assessment of a partner's economic policies. The designation in December 2020 and the USTR's subsequent finding in January 2021 left the US-Vietnam relationship on a knife's edge. The incoming Biden administration inherited a ticking time bomb, with the legal authority and justification for a trade war already in place. The resolution of the crisis would require a significant pivot in US policy and a masterful display of diplomacy from both sides. The change in the White House in January 2021 was the critical turning point. The Biden administration's foreign policy priorities were fundamentally different from its predecessors. The narrow transactional focus on bilateral trade deficits was replaced by a broader, strategic emphasis on rebuilding alliances and strengthening partnerships, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, to compete more effectively with China. Punishing a key partner like Vietnam ran directly counter to this overarching goal. The shift in approach was immediately apparent. In its very first semi-annual currency report, released in April 2021, the new Treasury team, led by Secretary Janet Yellen, reversed the Trump administration's decision. The report stated that there was insufficient evidence to conclude that Vietnam, or Switzerland, was manipulating its currency for an unfair trade advantage. As a justification for the reversal, the Treasury cited the unprecedented disruptions to global trade and capital flows caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which made it exceptionally difficult to analyze economic data and separate temporary effects from structural ones. This provided a convenient and plausible rationale for stepping back from the brink. While the incendiary currency manipulator label was officially removed, Vietnam was not given a clean bill of health. Instead, the Treasury moved Vietnam, along with Switzerland and Taiwan, to a newly defined category of enhanced engagement. This proved to be a clever and effective diplomatic solution. It served multiple purposes simultaneously. For the United States, it allowed the administration to de-escalate the conflict without appearing to ignore the statistical anomalies that had triggered the initial designation. It acknowledged that Vietnam's economic indicators still met the 3 criteria of the 2015 Act, but shifted the US response from a confrontational, punitive track to a cooperative, negotiated one. For Vietnam, it removed the immediate threat of sanctions and the stigma of the manipulator label. It provided a face-saving way to address US concerns through dialogue rather than being subjected to unilateral punishment. This enhanced engagement process created the diplomatic space necessary for both sides to find a mutually acceptable resolution and walk back from a trade war that neither wanted. The enhanced engagement process culminated in the climax of the resolution. A landmark joint statement issued on July 19, 2021, by U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and State Bank of Vietnam, Governor Nguyen Thi Hong. This agreement provided the formal off-ramp from the crisis. The statement detailed a series of specific commitments by Vietnam that directly addressed the core concerns of the United States, but did so in a way that respected Vietnam's sovereignty and its development needs. The key pledges were reaffirming IMF obligations. Vietnam formally confirmed that it is bound by the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund to avoid manipulating its exchange rate, to gain an unfair competitive advantage, and pledged to refrain from any competitive devaluation of the Vietnamese dong. This was a crucial acknowledgement of international norms. Improving exchange rate flexibility. The SBV committed to continue to improve exchange rate flexibility over time, allowing the dong to move more in line with economic fundamentals as its financial markets developed. This was a promise of gradual reform, not a sudden destabilizing change. Enhancing transparency. Vietnam agreed to provide the U.S. Treasury with the necessary information to conduct its analysis, improving the transparency of its foreign exchange interventions and reserve holdings. This addressed a key U.S. complaint about the opacity of the SBV's operations. The July 2021 agreement was the key that unlocked the diplomatic solution. Just days later, USTR Catherine Tai announced that her office was formally terminating its Section 301 investigation and would not be imposing any tariffs on Vietnam. She cited the Treasury SBV agreement as a satisfactory resolution of the matter. The Treasury Department followed suit, with subsequent reports noting that it was satisfied with progress made by Vietnam in addressing US concerns. The crisis, which had threatened to fracture a vital strategic partnership, had been successfully diffused. The successful negotiation of the July 2021 agreement marked the end of the acute phase of the currency crisis. However, it did not resolve the underlying structural issues that caused it in the first place. The story of the US-Vietnam trade relationship since then has been one of an uneasy truce, where the potential for friction remains even as the overall strategic partnership deepens to unprecedented levels. Despite the resolution, Vietnam remains on the US Treasury's monitoring list to this day. An economy is placed on this list if it meets 2 of the 3 criteria from the 2015 Act, and once on the list, it typically stays there for at least 2 consecutive reports to ensure any improvement is durable. An analysis of the most recent Treasury reports reveals a consistent pattern. Vietnam no longer meets the criterion for persistent, one-sided intervention. In fact, in 2022 and 2024, the SBV was often selling dollars to support the dong against depreciation pressure. However, it continues to meet the other 2 criteria. The bilateral trade surplus with the US remains massive, hitting $123.5 billion in 2024, far exceeding the updated threshold of $15 billion. And its global current account surplus has remained above the 3% of GDP threshold. This demonstrates that while the acute crisis is over, the statistical tripwires that caused it are still active. The fundamental economic imbalance, driven largely by Vietnam's role as a key node in global supply chains, persists. This lingering economic tension makes the trajectory of the overall US-Vietnam relationship all the more remarkable. The currency dispute proved to be a significant bump in the road, but it did not derail the journey toward a closer strategic alignment. Even as the trade friction was at its peak, high-level engagement continued. Vice President Kamala Harris visited Hanoi in August 2021, just a month after the currency agreement was signed. The culmination of this deepening trust came in September 2023, during President Joe Biden's visit to Hanoi. The 2 nations officially elevated their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. This is the highest tier in Vietnam's diplomatic hierarchy, a status previously reserved for countries like China and Russia. It was a powerful signal that both Washington and Hanoi viewed their shared strategic interests as paramount, capable of overriding periodic economic disagreements. In the end, the currency dispute served as a critical stress test for the US-Vietnam partnership. It exposed the inherent conflict between America's rigid, often domestically focused trade enforcement laws and its flexible, forward-looking geopolitical strategy. The fact that strategic imperatives, namely the shared goal of building a prosperous and stable Indo-Pacific and balancing the influence of a rising China, ultimately triumphed over the trade friction, is a testament to the profound depth and importance of the relationship. Yet the episode also serves as a permanent, cautionary tale. The underlying economic imbalances that sparked the crisis have not disappeared. As long as they persist, and as long as US trade law remains a blunt instrument, the potential for another friendly fire incident will remain a latent feature of this indispensable, yet endlessly complex, 21st-century partnership.